Okay, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Jim Conklin, actually James B. Conklin. I was born in Boston in 1943. My dad was an FBI agent who was stationed there during the Second World War, looking for spies around the Boston Navy Yard. After the war, he got to choose his office of choice. And of all places, he chose Detroit. So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, Irish Catholic family. My dad was an FBI agent. My mom was a homemaker. We had 5 kids. I'm number 2, and went to Catholic high school, graduate, and then Catholic high school, and then eventually St. Bonaventure University in upstate New York. Graduated in 1965 with a degree in philosophy. Afterwards, the Vietnam War was just beginning, and I joined up with the Marine Corps. I was highly influenced by JFK's statement, "Do something for your country." And so I joined the Marines, went to Officers Candidate School. After Officers Candidate School, I was assigned to Vietnam as an infantry platoon commander. I was there for 13 months. I came back. Following 3 years, I left I completed my enlistment and got into the workforce. Took a job first with a trucking company as a management company. They sent me to Rockford, Illinois. Very dissatisfied with that level of work, so I took a job in New York with a medical supply company selling orthopedic implants. I did that for about a year. Again, I was dissatisfied with the level of excitement. After a couple of years, I was living in New York at the time, and I was upset by a couple of things that were going on. One, there was the very anti-war feeling. Everything had moved to like the hippie days. There was a lot of protests of the Vietnam War, and a lot of mistreatment of military veterans. I mean, I thought we had done a great job in Vietnam, only to find out you didn't want to even tell people that you were in the service because you would be shunned. You couldn't get a date with a single girl. They would not go out with a guy who had been in the military. And everybody started using drugs. Everybody was smoking marijuana. And it just seemed, I'd watched it start to corrupt the military near the end of my military career. And with my friends in New York, even people I knew were smoking marijuana. One of my close friends from college, I went to a basketball game with him after I got out of the service. I was playing in Madison Square Garden, and he had this big beard and this long hair, and all he did was talk about using drugs. And then he overdosed and died shortly thereafter that. And I really thought something needed to be done about the drug situation. I talked to a friend of mine who was a Marine Corps recruiter in New York City, and he told me about BNDD, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He said that they're fighting the drug war, and that they're recruiting because it's the war on drugs. I called one of the supervisors on a number he gave me, and he set me up with an interview, and I became a drug enforcement agent. Actually, an agent of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in April of 1971.
And Jim, we talked a little bit about this before, but was there something growing up that led you to law enforcement? I mean, obviously, you had that, that experience with drugs in New York and everything else that kind of drove you a little bit. But was there anything in your background that kind of drove you to law enforcement?
Well, my dad was an FBI agent, and I would say in my life, he was my hero. My dad was always strong guy, and he did exciting things. He didn't talk about it very much, but every once in a while they'd arrest some guy that was in the papers. One time he got a top 10, one of the FBI's top 10 wanted list guys. I did a little report on it in school. I just thought it was very exciting to me, and he was doing the right thing. It was at JFK days. You want to do something for your country, and my mother was very patriotic also. So it was, I believe, their influence that kind of opened the door. Although I had absolutely no interest in going into law enforcement until such time as I saw the effects of the drug world, and so I applied and was accepted into DEA because my dad said to me, "Why didn't you join the FBI?" And I said, "Because drugs are the issue of the day. This is the real issue that I think needs to be addressed."
Okay. So in 1971, you start off with the BNDD, and I think you said that you start off in New York. Can you give me a kind of an idea how work was back in '71 with BNDD in New York? What kind of cases were you working on?
Well, when I first got assigned, I went to old Group 4, which became Group 21, I believe it was, or 22, and run by a guy named Lenny Vecchione. We had an organized crime group, and it was we worked all the time. We were out on surveillance all the time. We didn't make a whole lot of cases because these were major guys we worked on, but we did do tons of surveillance on these mostly Italians that were believed to be mafia guys, and eventually we made a huge case where we got about 100 kilos of French Connection heroin, pure white, diagnosed at 100%. Sorry about that. But we arrested a capo, 2 lieutenants, and another maid guy. They were all major targets of DEA, and they all got about 30 years in that time. We made several cases against major mafia guys. I was a new guy, so I was more of a helper. I didn't make any of the cases. They were other guys in the group. My boss had a lot of informants himself, and you were kind of kept in the dark other than helping out. In those days, the bosses didn't speak to you very much when you first came on the job. And funny story is, when I came on, my dad had called some people he knew in the FBI in New York, and when they had called my boss and told me that I was starting on the job, and they put me in this group, but my supervisor, in hearing it, thought, here's an FBI guy, son of an FBI guy, he's probably a plant by inspection, so I'm not going to say nothing to him. And that's the way it was for about 6 months. But eventually we became close, and we did well. But after a while, we had a group full of Irish Americans and no Italians, and they wanted an Italian to buy as an undercover agent. So a guy named Frankie Tummillo they recruited him from another group, and they sent me to the airport where we had started a program because they were getting, at that time, starting to search luggage of passengers. Before they had, as they do today, the security to go for it, they had the U.S. Marshals searching people's luggage. And so we were out there to assist in all the drugs that were being seized. The guy, Frankie Tummillo, took my group. My desk on a Monday, was killed in an operation on Friday. And it was an undercover deal where they had met with a couple of traffickers in a hotel room. They made the ultimate mistake of flashing the money, and then they said, "We'll wait here till you bring the dope back." They said, "We'll be back in a couple of hours." They went right downstairs, put a bunch of guns in their pants, came back up and shot Frankie Tummillo and killed him, and shot my supervisor, Tom Devine, who had taken over for Lenny Vecchione in that group, and paralyzed him. So it's a lesson that I learned for the rest of my career. If any time you flash money, you tell them you're moving the money out of that spot so that they don't know where the money is when they go to get the dope.
Jim, so can you give me an idea in '71 when you started in New York, and BNDD is relatively new at that point, was there any sort of not necessarily interaction with the public, but what was the public's view on BNDD, and then later on, early in your career, when BNDD transfers to DEA, what was the attitude toward you guys at that time?
I think a lot of people thought they were all corrupt. They thought that we were all in the take. NYPD had a bad reputation. Since we worked strictly narcotics, I think it always has an public had an attitude that you're corrupt. Actually, the opposite was true. They were probably the finest bunch of people I've ever known. Dedicated, worked around the clock. They were probably, like I said, the best group of people I've ever worked with. The agents were terrific. Even the cops that were assigned, because eventually I went to the New York Task Force, the cops were terrific. We made a lot of cases, and I think the public should be aware that these cases were hard fought. I mean, we put a lot of effort into, and took a lot of drugs off the streets.
So once you got out of the airport group, what was your next assignment? Was it still in New York?
My next assignment was the New York Task Force.
Okay, and how was that? What did you guys work on in New York Task Force?
We worked general crimes, general stuff. It was my first opportunity to go undercover. I remember buying cocaine from several traffickers. Coke was really popular in those days. And we worked on several heroin cases also. Our priorities were heroin and cocaine, and we didn't do dangerous drugs or marijuana in those days.
Okay. All right. So after the New York Task Force, where do you go?
So I got transferred to San Diego.
Okay.
1974.
Okay. And is during that time in 1974, early on, do you remember when does BNDD convert to DEA?
1973.
Okay.
So a year before I went there, it became DEA. President Nixon signed the order, taking the enforcement elements of customs, combined them with BNDD, and formed DEA. 1973.
Okay. So you get transferred to San Diego, and it's then DEA. At that point, there's been a change in transfer policy over the years and everything else. But at that point, is that a forced transfer? Do you want to go to San Diego? How does that work?
He sent a list around to every agent. They were building up the southwest border because we had, after this merger, we had a lot of new offices all along the southwest border where customs was real strong. So that list was sent around. Initially, I didn't sign up for anything. A lot of the more popular spots, the Phoenixes and that were gone. And there was one place that nobody signed up for, and it was called San Ysidro, because that's where the office was located, which is 10 miles south of San Diego. I took the step of calling out there and finding out it was right below San Diego. And I thought, well, I can do that. So after 3 years, you were allowed to transfer out of New York.
Okay. And so what kind of cases were you working on in San Ysidro?
Well, first I was in a border group. The border group works 12-hour shifts on the border. And you have a huge amount of people entering and exiting the border crossing every day. And the customs people would search anybody that they had enough probable cause, if they could develop probable cause. In a minute they talked to them, asking them why they're coming to the States or what have you, they would send them into secondary and search the cars. And each shift you would get 3 to 10 cases of drugs. and it was mostly heroin and marijuana. Some cocaine too, but it would just be hidden every place you can imagine in a car, inside the tires, in the trunk of the car. Sometimes you just pop the trunk and there's 400 kilos of grass. It would be they would swallow balloons of heroin, and you'd actually take them to a doctor and have them pass those in your presence. It wasn't really the best duty, but it was a whole different type of law enforcement than it was in New York. But the result was we got a lot of informants. We made a lot of informants, and led us to bigger cases.
Before you go on, I've been talking to mainly West Coast people at this point, but obviously we'll get to some East Coast stuff. But you now have that perspective of starting in New York and then going to San Diego, San Ysidro. Did you notice any difference in, I guess, the police work or the law enforcement culture between the East Coast and the West Coast?
For sure. I mean, the border towns were predominantly customs. When the merger happened in New York, we got like one customs guy to join our groups in New York. But when we went out there was maybe 30 customs agents, and there was maybe 5 BNDD agents to join. So it was more custom oriented. I remember going into meeting the boss. His name was Cesar Diastado at the time, and he had a guayabera on, casually dressed, smoking cigarettes like a fish. He was, and he spoke half in Spanish and half in English, of which I didn't speak Spanish. They immediately took all of us guys who transferred in and hired a professor to teach us Spanish. So we'd go in an hour early before the day started, and we'd have an hour of a Spanish lesson. And it was actually turned out pretty good, because at the border, everybody who arrested spoke Spanish. So you had to be able to fill out a 202, ask them where they lived and what they were doing with the drugs and one thing or the other.
Yeah.
So they were Spanish oriented. We worked in Tijuana all the time. In those days, you do a lot of undercover in Tijuana. You do make cases down there, and up San Diego. And plus, you had the smuggling by boats also. So you had the boat element, and you had the border, and it was full of drugs. It was a really very interesting office to work in, and very, very busy.
So that's interesting that you were doing work in Tijuana, because obviously in this day and age, I mean, you're going to have special permission. There's people that work in different countries and all that other stuff. But back in your days, you were just free to work cases essentially in another country.
Yeah, we used to go down there for lunch. I mean, it was right across the border. It was just a fence between us. But we had one particular group called the Mexican group. It was all Spanish-speaking agents that worked in there all the time. They worked with the Mex Feds and the state police, Baja State Police, all the time. And but anybody that developed a case there could work it down there. And the difference there, I'll tell you one little quick story. I developed a case on at that time there was mini bennies were a big drug.
What was it?
They're called mini bennies.
Okay.
They were little amphetamine tablets.
Okay.
And they would come in pillows. They'd call them pillows of about 1,000 or 2,000 each. And we were doing a case, and we had developed the source. And the source was down in Tijuana. So I went there. I went undercover on this to buy the marijuana. And I was working with the Mexican group. We're doing a surveillance. It was in an auto shop in Tijuana. And I went in there, and the guy said, okay. He said, just bring me the money, and they're outside. The drugs are outside the trunk of my car. I'll give you the keys. Just go get them. So I go outside. He's still in the shop, and I run over and ask Johnny Phelps, the GS of the Mexican group, because I knew it had Napoleonic code. You have to get the person with the drugs in his hands. They can't arrest him for the way he had set this thing up. So he says, okay, here's what you do. Go get the drugs, take them back into the shop, and throw them at him. And when he catches them, we'll arrest them, which is what we did. So they had a little different law, but we had to understand the laws in Mexico and abide by them. Of course, there was a lot of corruption there.
And so that was one of the rules in Mexico where the person had to possess the drugs.
Yes.
Yep. Interesting. Okay, so after you get done with that group where you're working 12-hour shifts, do you get what's your next group? Is it another?
Then I
group
go to just a regular street group.
Okay.
A street law enforcement group.
Okay, still in San Ysidro / San Diego.
Yes.
Okay, and what kind of cases are you working there?
We were general enforcement cases. By that time, I had made a few informants. So I had one guy, his name was Roberto Salazar, who I had arrested at the border, but he came back and he wanted to cooperate with me. And he was a terrific young informant, a young guy. And he did heroin cases. And we did several heroin cases with him, mostly by an ounce, knock off 10 ounces, a pound, and what have you.
What was a big quantity back then, either for cocaine, heroin, whatever? Back in your day, what would be considered a large case?
Well, for that area, I would say that for marijuana, maybe half a ton or a ton would be a decent sized case. For heroin, a kilo, very rarely to get more than that because they bring it across the border in small amounts. They shotgun it, they call it. They have multitude of cars bringing over smaller amounts, so they don't lose too much of the time. And the people that drive it across are paid $100 to drive the drugs across the border. So usually, it was probably the occasional 10 kilo of heroin case, but generally it probably would be smaller amount. It was black tar heroin.
And just for clarification for the viewers and watchers, a kilo is how much?
2.2 pounds.
Yeah.
2.2 pounds.
Okay. So,
but that's how they sell it. For some reason, they use the metric system.
Okay.
So it was usually packaged in kilo quantities. But a lot of the stuff coming across the border was in smaller amounts. But in a general thing, because of budget restrictions, they wanted you to order something up first, small amount, then you could get it back take it to the lab, find out the quality of it, so that we can talk intelligently when we negotiate another deal. So if the stuff came back 30%, it's been cut a lot, it's not good dope, you want to be able to tell the guy it's not worth what we're paying. So, but generally, the black tar heroin is 60, 65, 70% pure. It's about as pure as you could get it. And we'd buy sometimes two, and then we'd order up to whatever limit we would. While we were doing that, if that trafficker lived in the U.S., we would do surveillance of him to see where he went to, and hopefully identify a source of supply, see where he gets it, and he brings it back to meeting. We arrest him, then we go back and do a search warrant on and arrest the source of supply. So we made a lot of good cases in that method. And, there was also airplane cases. There was a lot of air smugglers in those days. That was mostly grass. And boat smugglers.
And back in those days, I mean, and I don't know if you're starting to work on this and everything, but you mentioned grass, marijuana, or whatever else. What would be if DEA was working on those cases, those type of cases, what kind of quantity were we talking about? In terms of, once DEA became interested in say a marijuana smuggler, what kind of quantity would that person have to be distributing in order for you guys to be interested at that point?
Well, we used to have a system called GDEP. GDEP was a system where you identified a person as a class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 4. Class 1 would be like a cartel head. Class 2 would be like a major guy in a organization. Class 3s were ounce level dealers, and Class 4s were street users. So the DEA was taxed with Class 1 and Class 2s only. The Narcotics Task Force did Class 3s.
So would it be fair to say that, as a general rule, you're talking about several hundred pounds, a ton, half a ton of marijuana when you are starting to target these guys?
Right, exactly. I mean, I remember we did a big case where we went to Mexico. I was undercover on the case. We flew a plane down there, met the traffickers. They brought the marijuana to the plane, but we had to take them down with the Mex feds because we couldn't take that drugs out of the country. So then we flew up to San Diego, or an airport where we got a packaging apparatus, a press that we had seized, and we took a bunch of hay and made up kilos of marijuana, about 400, I think, maybe a half a ton, and we found a thing called patchouli oil, which was a perfume like that the hippies were wearing. It smelled just like marijuana, and we doused all the marijuana with patchouli oil, and flew that up to a remote airstrip in the northern part of San Diego County, where we delivered it to the crooks and took off that organization.
So just for clarification, so the real drugs had to stay in Mexico. You guys basically created hay with patchouli oil and everything else, flew it up to whoever the real drugs were supposed to be delivered to, gave them the hay, for lack of a better term, and they got taken off because they were expecting the real drugs anyway.
Right, and I think we had to leave a certain amount. I don't remember how much it was, maybe one kilo of real marijuana in that delivery for legal purposes.
Right.
But we prosecuted the case and it went through. So the U.S. Attorney's Office was terrific. They took every case we gave them in those days. About once a week, you'd go and sit down in front of the grand jury with a stack of cases like that, and they would go ahead and indict every one of them.
Okay, so is there another group that you go to after that, or?
Yes. In 1979, I was transferred to the Narcotics Task Force. They usually like people to do a tour in there. I was a little not too excited about going there because I thought it'd be small level cases. But I went to what was called Special Investigations Unit of the Narcotics Task Force. And that's if a case was really developing. You would go there and assist the local guys in making the larger case out of it, working closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I did a real big pill case in the very beginning, many bennies again, where we ended up getting 7.5 million pills seizure and a press. We took out probably 10 different levels of things till we got to the very major guy who we fished across the U.S. He was in Mexico. Come up for a meeting and arrested him, named Mario Pintado. It was a really, really nice case. It was really a well-done case.
So curious about that. At that time, when you were getting 7.5 million pills, are those coming up from Mexico as well?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, they're all produced in Mexico. All those many bennies were produced in Mexico, and they were sold all over the United States. So it would come up to San Diego, where there was a main distribution point, and then they'd go all around the country. And they were mostly sold to college students. Stay up to pass those all that exams.
And so, when you say task force, can you explain what a task force is? Who's part of the? Traditionally, when you get transferred into a task force, or what is a task force?
A task force is just a group of of law enforcement people from different agencies that they put together. It's under the DEA system. We use DEA paperwork. We usually prosecute through the U.S. Attorney's Office. And we have DEA agents mixed with, this time, San Diego PD, the San Diego Sheriff's Office, and a lot of like La Mesa, El Cajon, Coronado, a lot of small PDs joined in. It was a very effective, because primarily the PD gets a lot of information which they used to keep to themselves. All the drug information they passed to the task force. So we had the advantage of having all the information that came to the PD from neighbors that saw things and call-ins, informants picked up by small PDs and what have you. And it was a very effective organization, very well run and with terrific cops. Which kind of leads me to a next big case I made, which is on a company called a business narcotics organization called the Coronado Company. And in this case, I got a call from a guy in the task force who was with the Coronado PD. And he said, hey, we've arrested a guy. He says he has information on some fugitives. Now, to back up a little bit, fugitives were very common in those days. Is you'd arrest a guy on a case, if they got out on bail, all they had to do was move away, start using another name, get some fake ID. There was no way to trace them before computers. So we had lots of fugitives. When I first got to the task force, again, you got a stack that big of fugitive cases because DEA had to investigate and write a report about every fugitive every 30 days. So you'd have 25, 30 guys, you'd have to write a report. And generally we check the PDs, no one's arrested him. We called an informant who's never heard of where the guy went. So things like that. And you'd have to write those reports, which are kind of a pain in the neck at the time. And I had this big stack of them, and including I had a stack of guys from the Coronado Company. There was a big case made on him about 3 years earlier. And the Coronado Company is a group of college kids, high school kids in Coronado High. They got together with their Spanish teacher. They recruited their Spanish teacher to negotiate drugs in Mexico. At that time, they started off taking, they got the swim team, and the swim team would swim from the Coronado Strip, it's called, down to Mexico, where they put a bunch of grass, and they'd swim it back to Coronado. Then they started using surfboards.
Okay, now wait a minute. So I'm curious about this. They're swimming down into Mexico. How much are they swimming back? What are the quantities at that point?
Probably it would be like a container that had some kind of flotation device in it, I think.
Okay.
I would say maybe 10 kilos at a time.
Okay. All right.
Mexican pot.
Okay. So then they transition to surfboards, and then what happens?
Then they transitioned to Zodiac boats. And by the first indictment occurred about 3 years before I got there. And they were using Zodiac boats at that time. They were making a lot of money. And now these guys are mostly out of high school. Now they've mostly graduated from high school by this time.
And what are the quantities they're bringing in now with the Zodiac boats?
They're bringing in like 1,000 pounds at a time.
Okay.
So they've got a real business going. But they get indicted, and nobody hears from them again. And the heads of that was a guy named Louis Villar, a guy named Eddie Otero, a guy named Robert Lahadney, a guy named Lance Weber. They were the four heads of it. They had maybe 30 other smaller workers who did the work on it. They all became fugitives. So one day I get a call from the Coronado PD, and he tells me about, hey, we just arrested a guy. He says he's got information where Eddie Otero lives. And so I go talk to him, interview the guy, and he says, yeah, I was at a party a couple weeks ago where Eddie Otero, who I know from high school, and I can take you to this place. I don't remember the address, but I can take it to it. It's up in Santa Barbara. So I says, hop in my car. So we drove up to Santa Barbara. He points out the house. But unfortunately, the house is unoccupied. So I went to the post office, talked to the postal inspectors, and they told me that the mail is being forwarded to a woman by the name of Bambi Merriweather. And I always remember the name, Bambi Merriweather, unusual name. We get back to the office, and I run Bambi Merriweather's name through the computer system DEA has called NADIS, Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Information Systems. I ran it through that, and I get a hit. Boom, Bambi Merriweather. And it was a case out of, it was a report written in Norfolk, Virginia. And turns out, talking to the office, that a guy had walked into their office, and he gave up a guy who he knew by the name of J.R. Roberts, I believe it was, who had hired him to put a teak floor on his Hilton Head home. And he knew him as J.R. Roberts, I think. So eventually we flew that guy out to San Diego and debriefed him, showed him a bunch of pictures, and he picked out J.R. Roberts as Louis Villar. He had also, besides he was a really fine woodworking person, and he had been shorted about 25 grand in payment, so he was upset about it. But Lou Villar had also taken this guy to 4 other houses that he owned, and he met all of his friends, and he met Eddie Otero and Robert Lahadney, Lance Weber, all the other heads of the Coronado Company, all were fugitives. He knew where they all lived. He also said they had millions of dollars. These guys had beautiful homes all over the place. They had, Lou Villar had 18 cars. Mercedes, what do they call that? Ford Lotus, had all kinds of fancy cars, Ferraris. So at that time they had formed a group in San Diego called the Asset Removal Team, and they had just formed them. So I walked down to those guys and I said, "Listen, we have these fugitives, which I could go up and pick up today on their old warrants. But apparently in the 4 years they've been fugitives, these guys have become really big time. And they are major, major smugglers now. And the informant had told us they're bringing marijuana in from Thailand." So I said, I think we should make a financial case. There'd never been a financial case made on the West Coast. It just passed the financial law. I forget the statute, 21 USC something or other, but it was a newly formed law, and it hadn't been enacted yet on the West Coast. So we began looking into their assets, and he'd pointed out an accountant that they had in San Diego. We started doing trash runs of the accountant. The accountant threw away a copy of everything, and I would get in the back of a trash truck every Monday or Tuesday, whatever it was, and we'd go there, pick up his trash, and the San Diego Trash Company cooperated fully. We found documents related to all their property and all the different assets they had seen. We found out they had formed businesses in Hong Kong, and so that they would smuggle their money into Hong Kong, which is a free market. You can bring as much money as you want to into it. And then they would come, and they formed companies such as the Mo-Ching Trading Company. That company would buy their homes all around there. So sounded like they were purchased by a Hong Kong business. Their names never came up. It had an elaborate way of keeping themselves safe. And at Santa Barbara was between DEA offices, between LA and San Francisco. So it was little law enforcement there. So we waited till November the 5th of 1981, and we sat up on that house. At that time, DEA had no budget. We couldn't even buy gas because they had a big gas crisis going on. So people just spent their own money. I said about a team of agents up there. They sat on Lou Villar's house and the other places for about 4 days. So we saw Lou Villar eventually come out of his car driving a Mercedes 450 SEL 6.9, which was the big car with the drug dealers in those days. We took off Lou Villar, we took off Bob Lahadny, took off Eddie Otero. Lance Weber was nowhere to be found. And we took off another guy who was the chief of operations named Dave Vaughn. And we got all kinds of documents. We got $1 million in cash. We got a lot of, we seized as many of those vehicles as we could. And we seized like $12 million on that case. We eventually indicted all those people. And we eventually did several rounds of indictments, getting the accountant, the attorney out of San Diego, not Phil DeMassa. And we seized a lot of money, a lot of cash and a lot of bank accounts and a lot of assets. Early days of asset seizures, I mean, it was kind of a nightmare because they didn't have a budget designed to maintain those things. So a lot of those houses got broken windows and nobody to maintain them. The grass would grow, but it was a struggle in those days to figure out how to get rid of assets. But since that time, the whole thing got refined and it made the seizure law easier. At that time, they required absolute tracing by the seizure law, which means you had to have an informant with you when you sold the dope, when you took the money to the bank, when you took the money out of the bank and bought a Ferrari. And that's pretty impossible with the big organizations that had lawyers and accountants. So the IRS tipped us off into their system, which is called net worth. In which case you just had to show they haven't done a tax return in 10 years. When they did, they said they had assets of $5,000, and now you can prove they've got $50,000. So everything between that you can seize, which is the theory we used. That's how we seized all the assets.
So Jim, just for I guess clarification here. So these guys start as they're swimming drugs back into Mexico, 10 kilos, 20-pound plus things.
Swim team.
Swim team. And then they end up as major smugglers of Thai marijuana. How much are they bringing in at that point?
They were bringing in like 10 tons at a time from Thailand.
Okay.
Now we're talking Thai sticks. And if you're familiar with Thai sticks, it was the drug of choice at the time.
And so what are Thai sticks? For people that
Thai
don't know?
sticks is a piece of bamboo that they have. They take the flowering female head of the Thai marijuana, and they wrap it to this piece of bamboo with a monofilament fishing line, and it's called a Thai stick.
And what was the purpose of doing it that way?
It was just, I think, the Asian mystique. A lot of the grass smugglers in those days were Buddhist. They were Americans, but they had developed the Buddhist lifestyle. They were sort of old hippies, and they were vegetarians, and they all drank carrot juice, and they had a very holistic lifestyle, all including, but they all got into greed. They got into making tons of money on Thai grass, and it would sell for Mexican, regular marijuana, good marijuana from Thailand was $1,500 a pound. Now we're talking about Mexican pots, like $100 a pound. Thai sticks would go for $16.50 a pound. $32 million a ton. So you could go to Thailand, and you'd have to have a ship and a crew that's capable of piloting that ship. That might cost you $1 million. Buying the grass might cost you $100,000 a ton, maybe 10 tons, so another $1 million. But you're going to sell that 10 tons for $300 million.
So, in terms of logistics and the boats, renting the boat, renting the crew, and everything else, what kind of ship are we talking about?
We're talking about motherships. These are freighters. you know, it has to be capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean. A lot of them were kind of junky because they would pay cheap, cheap for them, and there was a lot of ships that went down. But then they had to be able to look good enough to be able to get into the U.S. and then be offloaded. And they either, mostly they would anchor offshore somewhere, and they would have smaller boats go over, pick up the grass, and take it in.
Okay. So, Jim, you go from New York. You're there for 4 years. San Diego, you're there for 11 years. Then what happens?
Then I transferred to Bangkok.
Okay. And how does overseas DEA, how does that work? Are you getting chosen? Are you putting in for it? How does that process work?
What that process is when there's an opening overseas, the DEA puts out an advertisement, and they say, you know, we have an opening in these positions, overseas office. It's strictly volunteers. Anybody that wants to go can put in for it. I had become familiar with Thailand. One, I went on R&R from Vietnam to Thailand back in the Vietnam War, and then I also went to Thailand in the course of the Coronado Company case. I went over there to try and get shore up corroborate some evidence that we needed to corroborate it for trials on that first case, the Coronado Company case. So now I was familiar with the operations in Thailand, and I went over there in 1985.
So before we begin in talking about what you did in Thailand, can you give a general explanation of what DEA does overseas? So we have offices all over the world in different countries. What's the primary mission for DEA overseas in foreign countries?
The mission of DEA in foreign operations is direct impact cases. We look to encourage the Thai police to make cases based on people that are smuggling drugs into the United States, because Thailand is a source country. A source for heroin, Asian white heroin, and a source for Thai marijuana. And they send those drugs all over the world. Amsterdam, Milan, you name it, South America, every place. But we try and get the police to focus on traffickers that are sending drugs to the U.S., or at least the loads that are going out. In Thailand, as in most of the foreign countries, we have a group of foreign narcotics officers. So in Thailand, it was called the FANC, Foreign Narcotics Anti-Narcotics Group. And we have Australian police, Chinese police. No, I'm sorry, we didn't have Chinese. We had Japanese. We had French, Dutch, German, Italian, New Zealand. We had officers from all around the world in Thailand, because this is a source country, and we would cooperate with each other. If we were working on a particular trafficker and you send a load to New Zealand, we would call the New Zealand authorities and turn it over to them, and they would do the same for us.
Okay, so you get to Thailand in what year?
1985.
1985. What do you start working on once you get there?
Okay, I'm assigned to a group called CSD. Can't remember exactly what it stands for right now, but Crime Suppression Division. And underneath a colonel named General, General, he became a general, but he was a colonel at the time, Kamkrit Patpong Panat. And he's still a very good friend of mine. And he's a fine police officer. And Colonel Kamkrit, we pulled him out of the Thai police headquarters and rented a house. And him and his group of officers worked strictly for DEA. We paid for that whole operation. We rented the house. We paid the gas and electric. We even had a cook there to make food. A lot of the young guys would actually lived at that house. Thai police officer was paid about $100 a month. They didn't even give him a gun. they'd have to save up their money and get together with 2 or 3 other friends to buy one gun to share between them. Terribly dedicated, just terrific police group. And General Concrete was a very, very good manager of this. And he was a wealthy man himself, from a very wealthy family in Thailand. But he was a big believer in law enforcement and anti-drugs. He was educated in Germany, but very, very fine man, and was a terrific asset in together to work with. So what we did in that house is we worked primarily on Chinese traffickers, Chinese heroin traffickers, because the heroin market is kind of run by Chinese. Mostly speak a dialogue called Taochou Chinese. So we ran 35 wiretaps at all times. We don't run those like we do in the States. These are run with a voice-activated tape recorder, and we send a guy up a pole, and he'd clip onto the lines, and we'd run it back to we called it Building 11, where we had this wiretap thing. And we had hired, away from the CIA, I may mention, a Chaochu speaker named Mr. Chang. And Mr. Chang would come in each morning, and he'd listen to all those wires. And he'd switch them faster than you could change shirts. And we would keep up on all the heroin traffickers. Back in the day, 1949, when Chairman Mao took over China, a lot of Chinese fled. A guy run by Chiang Chi-fu, who became the famous opium warlord, Kun Sa, settled in northern Burma. As you know, a bunch went to, under Chiang Kai-shek, went to Taiwan. In Thailand, a lot of refugees came, and they all spoke that particular dialect, and that's the dialect of the heroin traffickers. So we needed a Chinese interpreter because the Thais couldn't understand these wires. He would listen to them. He would write out a report in Thai so that the Thais could understand it, and then I would get those reports and take them to my translator, who would translate them into English so we could understand them. And of course, this was all done telephonically if something happened quickly. So what we did is we wiretapped the sources of supply and looked for loads going to the United States, and those we would traffic on. So it's very fascinating how we did this whole operation. And we'd fund the Thai police in cash every at the beginning of each month to pay the rent, to pay the food, pay the anything special that they needed in conjunction with this operation. Well, it wasn't there a short time when I got a call from General Concrete. He says, one of our traffickers is sending a load to the United States. We just don't know where at this stage. But we think we have an ability to find it out, because it's going to be a large load of heroin. And the labs are all in, the heroin labs are actually in Burma at this time. Burma or Laos, they're not in Thailand. But the traffickers produce the heroin there. They bring it into Thailand to ship out, because those countries you can't really ship out of in those days. So the heroin is produced by the Shan United Army under Kun Sa, and it is sold to this trafficker in Bangkok. That trafficker had it hidden, had it inside of a load of teakwood furniture that was built up in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand. But he said, we don't know where it's going, but we think it's going to go to the U.S. So he said, but the guy is actually, he won't discuss it on the phone. He told the guy who was putting it all together, the guy's behind. But he's going to write the address where it's going to be sent on a piece of paper, and he's going to send it up to Chiang Mai. And the way they did it, because I didn't trust a lot of people, is they would go to the bus station and they would give the bus driver who was going to Chiang Mai an envelope with the name on it, and said that guy will come up and pay you $100 when you get up there. You give him this address. So the bus driver goes up to Chiang Mai, and we have a young cop stop the bus, and tell him he wants to see that envelope. Took the envelope out, they steamed it open, and we got the address in New York City of where it was going. That was all the Thai cops able to do all that. So now we know we got a shipment of teakwood furniture going to New York. And so we checked Epic, which controls shipping, found out where that load was, what ship it was going to be on, and it was going to go into Long Beach Harbor. I called the New York DEA office. There was a Chinese heroin group run by a terrific DEA agent named Rich Lamagna. And I called Richie and I said, "Hey Richie, we got a load of heroin coming your way." He says, "Terrific." They just started off. They didn't have any informants. They were just a brand new group. And so they were able to identify that shipment where it was coming in. They flew to Long Beach and intercepted the shipment, picked it up, drilled into the furniture, got a sample of the heroin, and patched it back up again, put a beeper in it, and sent it on its way to New York, where they intercepted it again, or was picked up by a Chinese guy driven to Chinatown in a truck and delivered to a Class 1 major heroin trafficker, Chinese, which they arrested. I think they seized, I forget, it was well over 100 kilos. That's what we call them, units. In Thailand, it's called units, 700 grams. So it was well over 700 units of heroin. I mean, I'm sorry, it was well over 100 units of heroin. I don't remember the exact amount. But they arrested a whole organization. Richie's a really fine agent, worked closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They were able to make several indictments out of that case and seized about, I would say, around $1 million on that case. They indicted the source of supply, the guy we had the wiretap on. I can't recall his name right now, but I think it was President something. They indicted President back in New York, and because they were Chinese, they weren't Thai citizens. They didn't have passports. They were refugees, basically. So we did an informal extradition. We didn't have an extradition treaty with Thailand in those days. So what we did is wrote a letter to the we just picked him up as an illegal. I'm sorry, that's how we did it. We picked him up as being illegal in Thailand, and we met him at the airport with a ticket to New York, and flew him to New York. We call it informal extraditions, and we did many of them the time I was over there. It really shocked the hell out of the Chinese community, the heroin traffickers, because this had never happened. They were sort of protected as refugees, but they were not citizens. And being citizens, they could be, they were illegally in Thailand. So we took them out of there. They got to the airport. There was no place to go but the airline ticket we had, accompanied him back to New York. And I remember he paid about $100,000, $50,000 maybe in those days to an attorney. And in the Asian way of thinking, you pay that money to an attorney, you're going to go home. You're getting out of there. He got about 30 years, and he was really unhappy with that attorney. They didn't get to go home. We started doing that on a regular basis, and we made some absolute fascinating and terrific cases. against the Chinese heroin traffickers in New York.
And was that primarily what you did then in Bangkok? Those are focusing on the Chinese heroin then?
Primarily, but there's also the Thai marijuana thing.
Right.
And I ended up with a very large, in fact, the largest Thai marijuana case made. And that all began with, I had developed 2 American informants over there. I'll call him, Chris was the primary one. I'm just going to call him Chris, because he's still over in Thailand. And he'd been there since the Vietnam War. And he was a marijuana trafficker. And he decided to cooperate and became an informant. And I started making several good marijuana cases with him. But the one in particular I'll bring up was the one against a guy named Brian Daniels. And Brian Daniels was he was Mr. Big over there. He was the biggest source for Thai marijuana. And the way it works is, if you're a, let's say like the Coronado Company, like a Louisville, if he wants to get an order 10 tons of Thai marijuana, he would go to an American guy living in Thailand to arrange through the Thais to grow the marijuana. You have to prepay it. They grow the marijuana, package it up for you, and take it out to your mothership. But the people that spoke Thai and were traffickers were old hippies that had gone there to avoid the Vietnam War. And Brian Daniels was one of those guys. He'd been at that time in Thailand for at least 15 years or so. And it became a major source of supply. So one day, the FBI seizes $7.5 million in Reno. And they seize it from a guy named Richard Roman Kimball. But they don't know him by that name. He's got a fake name of Todd something or other. And the word gets to me that this Todd had been arrested with this seizure of money. Well, I knew Todd to be right-hand man of Brian Daniels. So I flew me over to Thailand. Actually, I was in the States on something else, so they asked me to go talk to him. I talked to him. I found out that this money was part of $40 million that was to be sent back to Brian Daniels from a previous load of Thai marijuana he had done. So I talked to my informant, Chris, and he had told me earlier that he had used to be partners with Brian Daniels. And they were still friends, but they didn't work together anymore because Chris had become his own source. So we set up a meeting. He said, "Hey, listen, by the way, was that your money that got seized in Reno?" And Brian says, "Yeah, I lost this money. I don't have a good system of getting my money back." And so Chris says, "I've got some undercover bankers, not undercover. I have some bankers that launder my money. And can you get them over here?" So we sent over 2 undercover DEA agents. They had fake passports. They had fake ID, credit cards. They came over. They met Brian. And he immediately sent him to get another $10 million, which they picked up in Oregon from another earlier deal also. And then he started working on his next load. And he says, "Hey, Chris, you want to join me on this one because it's a big load. We're doing a huge load, and we're growing the marijuana in Laos, and it's going to be 120 tons, largest marijuana load ever seized. Eventually, we seized that load. But in a nutshell, the marijuana was grown there. We used part of that $10 million in traffic director funds that we had seized to pay for that load, pay Brian's expenses, pay the Thais for growing it. It was shipped from Laos in Vietnamese army trucks to Vietnam, loaded in Da Nang Harbor, had the CIA photograph it for us because it was still no relations with these countries at the time. And they sent 120 tons over to the Seattle area. It was taken off outside of Seattle. We had introduced 2 undercover agents from Seattle that were allegedly boat operators and radio people, and they came over. They met all the guys who were actually going to take the ship over, and they seized had a gunfight with the ship. They took it down. The Coast Guard took it down off the coast, and we seized 120 tons of marijuana. Brian at that time flew to Switzerland. I flew to Switzerland with Chris, the informant, and we met with him. He was receiving $30 million from that earlier load I had talked about that was supposed to be part of the load that they seized in Reno. We wanted to wait on that $30 million. The U.S. attorney and I got into a bit of an argument over it. He got headquarters involved, and eventually they took. I lost. We didn't get the $30 million, but we did get Brian Daniels, and he got 25 years.
What year was that shipment seized in Seattle?
Seized in 1987, I think it was 87.
Okay, 87. All right.
Brian Daniels case, prosecuted by the more than famous Peter Mueller.
Okay, so Jim, just kind of finishing up on your Bangkok tour, your Thailand tour, what was your overall experience being with DEA overseas?
Well, Thailand is a wonderful place to live. Contrary to what people think, it's actually very safe. There's very little street crime. Guns are illegal, so that you don't have a lot of people carrying guns. There's very few murders, especially for I think we call Farangs, foreigners. For the Farang population, it's basically non-existent. So I had the real benefit is you get an embassy assigned home. So I had a nice 4-bedroom house that they assigned me. And my kids went to international school, which is a terrific school. I mean, you're a good year ahead of, my kids were like a year ahead of their people who stayed in the United States. So they came back with a great education. The food is wonderful. The people are very kind. They're Buddhists. Buddhists are very good people. And it was just a terrific experience. As far as the job goes, I worked with the Thai police. I know their reputation is corruption and what have you, but that is all changing about that time. They were actually a very good, efficient Thai police force, very supportive of DEA operations, and we worked very closely. I'm particularly close with General Comkrit Patpong-Panat, who become friends in the meantime, and we could basically do almost anything we wanted over there within the Thai law, and we would work together on many cases, and walked away with a feeling of like the best assignment I had at DEA.
I'm curious, in terms of other countries' perceptions on drugs, you had a real inside knowledge about how the Thais thought about drugs. What if you can give kind of a thought of how the Thais believed drugs were good, bad, harming society, whatever, in their particular country? Did you ever get that kind of impression from them?
Yes. Culturally speaking, there's a lot of nomadic tribes in Thailand. Chinese, they're in China, Thailand, what have you. They're called hill tribe people. And they're the Hmong, and they, besides the Hmong, there's the Karens, there's the Lao, the Akha. Those groups are nomadic groups that live up in the hills, and they all smoke opium, and they call it ya. Ya means medicine in Thailand. That's their only medicine. So opium is pretty well, for centuries has been used in Thailand, but not by the educated people. And they realized the problems that were coming from drug addiction, and they really were clamped down on it. And they were very anti-drug. Now, of course, there is still corruption, especially outside of Bangkok. You get up in the smaller police departments throughout the country. But all in all, the Thai National Police, that's who we worked with, were terrific. Good cops, very anti-drug, very great to work with, and very happy to work with DEA. And we were allowed to do most anything. It's one of the few countries we can carry a gun in. They were very supportive of my efforts. But at the same time, they always had somebody with you because they wanted to know exactly what you were doing.
Right.
But I have nothing but good feelings for the Thai people and particularly the Thai police.
Okay. Okay. So you finish up your 6 years in Bangkok, and you head back to San Diego for 5 years.
Yes, I got promoted. I was at this time still a street agent, GS-13 up until Thailand. I've got 20 years on the job now, and I go to San Diego, promoted to a GS-14. Became a group supervisor and assigned to the lab group. And the lab group is a group that works on clandestine laboratories. The big drug at the time was methamphetamine. And San Diego was where methamphetamine basically started. But by this time, it is starting to move all across the country. And methamphetamine is a very highly addictive drug. It's one of the worst drugs in the world. It's made with hydrochloric acid, which is a acid used to clean airplane engines. So this is how bad it is for you. It causes a lot of health problems. The fumes when they cook it are devastating in that they could kill you if they screw up the process. And they oftentimes take the residue and dump it in the water supply, and it's terrible for the environment. So you get a lot of issues with methamphetamine, including at the time when I was there, they determined that over half the homicides were related to methamphetamine, either fights over the drug, or dying because of making the drug, or shooting each other during the course of drug deals. So it was really a devastating drug in San Diego. In particular, and by now the United States, throughout the United States.
At that time in San Diego, what year was that?
1991.
Okay, so in 91, when methamphetamine is kind of taking over in San Diego, are you seeing, in terms of where it's coming from, is it coming from Mexico at that time, or is it predominantly coming from mom and pop labs?
It was in a shift period at that time. Back in the day, it was done by motorcycle groups, kind of the dirtbag white element up there. There were smaller labs. They produced meth that was maybe 60%, 65% pure. But it was quickly being overtaken by Mexican traffickers, but still produced in San Diego. And what they would do is they would go to like a farm. There's a lot of like orchards outside of San Diego, outskirts of the county, and there was orange groves, avocado groves, and they were usually owned by a investment group, a doctor's group out of LA, for instance, and they would have a Spanish-speaking Mexican foreman running the place, and they would go to those guys, they would pay them off, and they would go down in the canyons and set up a meth lab and cook the meth up in the fields, but they would disguise it with a lot of brush and things like that. So within a few years, that whole operation is going to move down to Mexico. But at this time, it was still majority of all the labs were in the U.S., but they were temporary. It's set up in the canyons. Where before, with the bikers, they were at an old house and they would produce it in the house. But then they had neighbors calling in and what have you. So because it's this pungent odor that comes with meth production. So we developed a pretty good program. The precursor chemicals for it, which is hydriatic acid, ephedrine. I can't think of the rest of them, but those are the two main ones. They were controlled. You couldn't get those in the U.S., but you could get them in Mexico. But Freon, they couldn't had trouble getting. So what we would do, we had gone to a company that sold Freon, and we put a beeper into a barrel, and they would fill it up with Freon for us, and they would sell it. And we tracked that beeper. And we did this, God, time after time. And invariably, it would be a Friday afternoon. All of a sudden, you get a hit. That beeper was moving. Before cell phones, we had just beepers, and we get like a string of sevens across your beeper. That means the beeper is moving. So we had an old Jeep that had a antenna system on the top, and my guys would run out, and we would track that can of Freon, and invariably it would go to a canyon in an orchard someplace. And I had a bunch of young agents. They were all highly motivated, terrific guys, a lot of them right out of the military. And they just loved it. They would go out there and they'd set up on this thing. They'd climb up on the trees and they'd set up on these labs. And luckily, I'd go home and go to sleep. And but I'd get up at 4 in the morning and go out and join these guys, and we'd hit them at first light. And we would raid these places, and they would scatter like ants. They the cook and all the workers, there'd usually be 8 or 10 of them. We'd capture as many as we could catch up with, and we'd always get a lot of meth, sometimes 100 pounds, sometimes larger. And we'd always get beans, burritos, and AK-47s, in addition to a lot of meth. And they were terrific cases. The conspiracy aspects was hard to get because most of they brought illegal workers up from Mexico. So most of the people weren't U.S. nationalities. If you got the cook, you were lucky. And we'd follow up however we were able to, if we were able to tie in any distributors or what have you. But it was, I mean, my troops just loved it. We just loved making those cases, and we were doing them probably every week or two.
Let me take a quick switch here. So you go from Bangkok and you get transferred back to San Diego, but you said you got promoted as a group supervisor. Can you tell me the duties you had? What were the duties that you had, and how did they differ from becoming a supervisor from an agent?
Yes. All of a sudden you're responsible for a group, which is a big responsibility because we're doing a lot of things that are dangerous and easy to get in trouble in as far as the law goes, so you have to be very careful. I was an older guy for being a GS, so I told my troops they could run the cases, but I would intervene if it was anything illegal or anything that was dangerous. And I would stop the case in a second if, in fact, I saw those. But if not, I let my troops run the case. I gave them all credit. I was already retirable. I didn't need another promotion, so I was happy to give all the credit away. And my troops responded. I mean, I tell you, I had guys that would work round the clock. I didn't have to motivate them. They were just highly motivated when they came on the job. DEA agents are very, very motivated, and these guys were all terrific.
Okay, so you're a supervisor for 5 years in San Diego, and you ultimately end up getting, I'm assuming, transferred to headquarters.
Yes.
Talk about that. Okay, ultimately, why'd you get transferred, and where'd you land at headquarters, and what were your duties?
Well, I think among all federal agents, no one likes going to headquarters. So I wasn't really excited about it. I really liked I've liked being in the field. I've been in the field my whole career. So I got transferred to headquarters. I I was already 52 years old. You're not supposed to be transferred after 52 if you don't want to go. But they decided headquarters needed me. So off I went. I was divorced at the time, so I was single. I got assigned to OF, Office of Foreign Affairs. Foreign Operations, I'm sorry, Office of Foreign Operations. At that time it was called, there was four desks underneath that. I was assigned to the Far East section, which is Asia, because of my background, having had experience in Asia. So there you're assigned certain offices to coordinate their cases with anything they need at a headquarters. There's a lot of paperwork that goes on. They send in cables. I would read all the cables from the offices that I was assigned to. I'd brief the head of the OF operations, who was a GS-15, who would go to the country meeting each morning, and he would speak up for any cases that were going on that were important enough to be brought to the attention of the administrator and the chief of operations. So you're a staff coordinator. I had the offices of Bangkok. I had Singapore. I think Rangoon. I kind of moved around, but it required a lot of travel because oftentimes you had to go to these offices, and the other agent that was in OF with me didn't like traveling, so I did a lot of traveling. So it turned out it was a terrific assignment. I really enjoyed my time in headquarters. I did a lot of travel, coordinating offices. And one of the biggest complaints you'll find from people in foreign offices is nobody supports them. They need something, and they can never find the right person in headquarters to approve it. So a lot of times the office will be looking for a new computer, and I can't find anybody that can okay it and send it over to them. So a lot of times you were doing it, kind of go for work. You were Singapore office needs a computer. You go and find out are there computers available. Package one up, put their name on it, send it over to them. Other times it'd be big casings. They needed financial support for cases. They needed permission to travel, prescriptions for drugs, all these type of things they would coordinate through the foreign operations desk. And it was actually very busy, and since I was single, I worked a lot of hours there too. I had no place to go but the office.
And I think, Jim, as we were talking beforehand too, can you talk about during this time you went TDY, for listeners and viewers, TDY is temporary duty station basically. So can you explain the TDY that you went to?
Yes. I went on a TDY to what was at that time Rangoon, Burma. Today it's Yangon, Myanmar. But in those days it was Rangoon. We had a DEA office there. There was a bit of an issue in the DEA office, and that the boss had been sent out of there for some sort of a problem. So they needed someone to run the office for a while. And coincidentally, at that time, I think I mentioned earlier in our conversations that Chang Chi-fu was also known by a Burmese name of Kun Sa, was the largest heroin trafficker in the world. And he was stationed up in the Shan states, northern part of Burma. He ran the Shan United Army, which operated a lot of heroin labs, the majority of it. And actually, if you look up at this symbol right here, that is the symbol of the Shan United Army heroin. And these are opium weights that were used. I bought those over there, used to weigh out small amounts of heroin. But anyways, Chang Chi-fu had been arrested, put under house arrest in Burma. The Burmese government has a bad reputation of being involved in the drug trafficking. I'm sure there are parts of the Burmese government that were, but the parts around Rangoon that they controlled were not. They were a bunch of actually right-wingers, anti-drug type people. So I went over there to run that office and also to attempt to interview Kun Sa, who was in house arrest. Try as I might, because we had not good relationships between the United States and the Burmese government at that time, I was never able to actually interview him, but I worked closely with a Burmese police officer named Kao Tang, and I was able to give him a list of questions that we were wanting answers to, and he sat down with Kun Sa and got the answers and brought it back. It was basically about you know, the involvement of the rest of his lieutenants, which is incidentally most of which were also under house arrest, and what happened to the labs? Are they still operating and things like that? Now, of course, it was all denials, and I think the Burmese government was afraid that if I were allowed me to interview Kun Sa, he might have implicated many generals in the Burmese army, been paid off over the years. So they never did allow me to interview him, but I think we got enough information to know what was going on with the United Army, which incidentally still operates today, but they've switched heroin production, and now all they make is methamphetamine. And they send that methamphetamine all around the world.
Okay. Well, Jim, two last questions for you. How many years did you do with DEA?
26.
26. So can you tell me, for those 26 years, how did being a DEA agent affect your family life?
I think positively, in that my kids don't use drugs, which is a plus, I think, in today's world. I think that you know, I always did the right thing. I think my kids follow the same kind of principles. I think it was tough in that I was gone a lot, not just with travel, but I mean, I worked a lot of late hours. My first wife had a bit of a major alcohol problem, and I feel I should have been home a lot more. But in order to do the job effectively, I was gone quite a bit. So that effect, I think it was adverse. Both of my kids went to college. They got advanced degrees, and they're all working now. So I think it's all in all, it was a positive thing. I think they both look back at their time in Thailand as a highlight of their lives. My daughter speaks fluent Thai. She has traveled back there several times. She works for in Washington, and I think it's helped her in her career. And my son just looks very favorably at his time in Thailand. The international school was really a wonderful school to go to for kids. The most popular kids were the best students. They weren't the ones that played baseball or football or what have you. There was all kinds of different nationalities attended, different customs, different habits, different holidays. They learned a lot just by going to the school.
Okay.
I think it's been a positive experience for everybody involved.
Okay. Last question for you. So in 26 years, if you can remember this, when you first started, before you went into law enforcement, and then 26 years later, do you think your views on people and society changed over those 26 years? And if so, how did they?
I've always been a positive person. I've always looked at the good in people. Even drug dealers, there's usually some sort of good in them. I've always appealed to that. I always had a lot of informants because I did realize that the drug traffickers do have issues. They do have problems. They got financial problems. They have one reason or another that brought them into drugs. Not one of them that we worked on, high level, were using drugs. Most of them were just strictly salesmen. I would recruit these guys as informants, and I think I appealed to the good part of them. And when you do that, I think you can get information that they give you because they trust and like you for not coming down on like a tough guy and trying to act like they're a terrible people. I still see the good in people, but I do think that I'm much more cautious with people. I certainly took a good. I look at them. I don't trust a lot of people. They better, when I get a phone call of some guy trying to sell me an investment in Czechoslovakia someplace, I delight in telling them that I investigate people like that a lot, and I put them in jail. But I do not trust people, but I think I do look for the good in people. And I think you can usually find at least a portion of good in everybody.
Very good. Jim, I really appreciate you talking to me. Thank you.
Okay.